everyone. Hello, hello. My name is Dennis. I use they and he pronouns, and I'm a learning officer here at EGAL. For any participants who are not able to see me today, I'm a white non-binary individual. I have red orangish hair with some facial hair. I'm wearing a dark navy blue shirt with a black headset, and I'm in front of a blue EGAL virtual background. As the moderator for today's session, I'll mostly be hiding in the background to make sure things are running smoothly for all of us. And since we're doing this in a virtual format, I just want to go over a few of the technical aspects to orient you before we get started. First, as you will have noticed when you arrived, the session is being recorded. We'd like to remind everyone, for the safety and comfort of all those attending, screen recording is not permitted. Next, for anyone not yet familiar with Zoom's interactive features, I'd like to take just a few quick moments to run through those with you. First, you should see a ribbon with buttons such as chat and Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Some of us have already found that. If you do not see these buttons, just scroll your mouse or swipe along the bottom of your screen and the ribbon should pop up for you. Clicking the chat button will open the chat pod. Once opened, you'll see a drop-down menu that allows you to choose who can see your chat contributions. We encourage you to share your comments with everyone, but you're also welcome to send messages privately to the panelists as well. Please feel free to drop in any questions that come up for you using the Q&A pod at any point during the session. We have reserved some time at the end for those questions as well. For all other types of discussion, I'd kindly ask you to please use the chat pod. Also, please note that participant lines are in listen-only mode today, so you'll not be able to ask any questions verbally. All questions and comments must be submitted in writing. Also, please note that closed captioning has been enabled for the session. If you'd like to show or hide the subtitles on your screen, you can click the CC button, which you can find beside the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, if you encounter any issues during today's webinar, do not hesitate to reach out to me privately by chat or to any of the panelists. And before I pass the mic over to our presenters, I'd just like to offer a brief intro to EGAL. For those of you who don't know us yet, EGAL is Canada's leading organization for 2SLGBTQI issues and people. We improve and save lives through research, education, awareness, and by advocating for human rights and equality in Canada and around the world. Our work helps create societies and systems that reflect the universal truth that all persons are equal and none is other. So now, with all of that said, I'd like to pass the mic over to one of our presenters today. Bree, take it away.
Nice. Thanks so much, Dennis. Yeah, my name is Brio Hanley. I'm a research officer here at EGAL, and I'm just going to briefly welcome you all to the final Research Highlights webinar of 2025. We had some really great webinars this year, and stay tuned for 2026. We'll have some more coming up to share the research work that we're doing here at EGAL. And so today, Gazel is going to be discussing a research project they're working on with Rainbow Veterans Canada. And so this study looks at reducing houselessness and housing insecurity among 2SLGBTQI Canadian Armed Forces and Royal Canadian Mounted Police veterans. And so a little bit about Gazel. Gazel is a qualitative researcher based in Treaty 1 territory. She completed her BA honors in sociology at the University of Winnipeg and has an MA in sociology from Carleton University, and is currently also a PhD student in sociology at Carleton. Gazel has over a decade of interdisciplinary research experience working on projects related to public health, social entrepreneurship, and critical disability studies. Here at EGAL, Gazel's research projects have looked at things like 2S LGBTQI diversity and inclusion initiatives in entrepreneurship, and 2S LGBTQI veteran houselessness and housing insecurity, as well as social determinants of health. And so, yeah, now that we know a little bit about Gazel, I'm gonna hand it off to her to tell us about her project.
Thanks, Bree. Hi, everybody. For today's webinar, I'm going to be sharing the preliminary findings of our study on 2S LGBTQI Canadian veteran houselessness and housing insecurity. So currently, we're just wrapping up our recruitment efforts and data collection phase as we're transitioning into data analysis. So the topics in this webinar are based on our initial observations of the research data during the pre-data analysis phase. So, just a bit of a land acknowledgement here. I'd like to acknowledge the lands that I'm currently residing in as an immigrant settler. I am located in Treaty 1 territory, also known as Winnipeg, the homeland of the Red River Métis, and the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, and Dakota Ayate peoples. And this research study is part of a collaborative effort with our project partner, Rainbow Veterans Canada. It's with their support we were able to develop our research design that is inclusive and considerate of the lived experiences of 2S LGBTQI veterans in Canada. And the project funder for this study is Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada, also formerly known as Infrastructure Canada. So here's a brief overview of what we will be covering in today's webinar. First is a brief introduction to the LGBT purge to provide further context, as understanding the impact of the LGBT purge is necessary to get a better understanding of the bigger picture regarding participants' lived experiences with houselessness and housing insecurity. And then next will be a brief overview of the project's background and some contextual information, going over specifics such as research goals, research questions, methodology. Afterwards, we will cover the initial research findings, specifically the risk factors to houselessness and housing insecurity, and supportive factors to overcoming houselessness and housing insecurity. And then we will go over the next steps for this project, such as future updates and timelines. And afterwards, I'll make any room for questions or comments. The experiences of the 2S LGBTQI veterans are inextricably linked to the events that transpired during the Canadian government's LGBT purge. The LGBT purge was a state-sanctioned campaign that systematically identified and removed LGBT members from the military, public service, and the RCMP. People who were identified as LGBT were under threat of losing their jobs and social standing due to stigma. Anyone who suspected of being LGBT was interrogated, harassed, or subject to blackmail, all of which was justified under the guise of protecting national security. The LGBT purge created conditions for a toxic environment. For instance, the fear of interrogations, being exposed, and being betrayed were commonplace. The culture of lateral violence made it difficult for 2S LGBTQI service members to trust one another, as people, including those who are LGBT, would report others for being LGBT or suspected of such, which was also done out of a sense of self-preservation. The homophobic and transphobic culture of the military fueled discrimination and encouraged bullying behaviors, especially directed towards those who are suspected of being LGBT as well. Not only has the LGBT purge impacted the 2S LGBTQI community, but also the heteronormative, homophobic, and transphobic ideologies of the purge affected service members who identified as cisgender and heterosexual, but they did not fit into the dominant conceptions and narratives of masculinity and femininity at the time. So many purge survivors lived with the trauma and endured lifelong repercussions due to what they had experienced during their military service. Purge survivors live with the negative effects of mental illness, difficulties securing employment, difficulties forming and maintaining relationships and social connection, and difficulties in being able to secure safe housing. Every single participant in this study has, in one way or another, been impacted by the purge and identified the LGBT purge as the root of their housing and financial challenges. Some background and context for our project. So our study is the first study of its kind in Canada and in general. Currently, there is little research on 2S LGBTQI veteran homelessness, with most literature written on the topic being situated in the United States. And while we can get some insights from the US, it cannot fully capture the Canadian experience. As we had covered previously, we had the LGBT purge. So in Canada, there are a few studies that focus on the experiences of veteran homelessness in general, especially among marginalized veterans. Of the very few studies that do exist, there's some with veteran women's homelessness, and these studies have explored the impact of military service on homelessness. And similarly, that's what this study aims to do as well. We want to examine the impact of military service on 2S LGBTQI veterans' experiences with houselessness and housing insecurity. So where the heart is, reducing houselessness and housing insecurity is a national qualitative research study focusing on the experiences of 2S LGBTQI veterans and their experiences being unhoused or housing insecure. While all participants in this study are veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces, we did open recruitment to veterans of the RCMP, but we did not have any approaches for this study. So the data that's presented here today comes from the perspective of those who served in the Canadian Armed Forces. The goal of this study is to understand the experiences of unhoused and housing insecure 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans and identify the unique needs and challenges of this population. By conducting this research, our goal is to develop resources and conduct knowledge mobilization to increase awareness about 2SLGBTQI veteran homelessness that could help inform future policies. As well, with the lack of research on this topic, we seek to conduct foundational research by filling in the research gaps. So the research questions guiding this study are: how did 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans experience houselessness and housing insecurity? Second, what can 2SLGBTQI veterans' military career, such as their pre-military career, so the moment where they're contemplating joining the military, and then during military service, the transition period where they're exiting the military, and then civilian life, what does that reveal about their experiences with houselessness and housing insecurity? And lastly, what factors put 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans at a higher risk for poverty, houselessness, and housing insecurity? So we're employing three theoretical frameworks to form the basis of this research study, which informs the research design, the methodology, and data analysis. So we use intersectionality, military life course, and minority stress lenses. For intersectionality, we would consider the ways in which gender, sexuality, disability, veteran status, age, and other positionalities intersect in shaping the experiences of 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans with houselessness and housing insecurity. The military life course theory examines the long-term effects of military service by taking into account the different stages of one's military career, starting from pre-military, active service, military career transition, and civilian life. So for instance, pre-military would refer to the life stage in which the individual is contemplating their decision to join the military. And while active service is self-explanatory, military career transition would be the period in which the individual is transitioning out of military service into post-civilian life. And then there is civilian life. So using this approach, we can better understand how the veteran's military experience may have played a factor in shaping the circumstances and events that may have led to becoming unhoused or housing insecure. And lastly, the minority stress theory examines how prejudice and stigma contribute to unique stressors experienced by marginalized groups. These stressors can lead to negative health outcomes. For example, how does prejudice and discrimination experienced during military service and post-military service affect the health and well-being of veterans? And in what ways has it impacted their capacity and ability to secure housing and financial stability? So those are the theoretical frameworks that's guiding this study. And the methodological approach for this project is rooted in community-based research practices. We designed the study with the lived experiences of 2SLGBTQI veterans in mind by consulting with our partner Rainbow Veterans Canada. We collected qualitative data using semi-structured interviews. We also had a photo elicitation component to this study, but it was not successful. The data collection timeline took place between March to October 2025. And in total, we only had 10 participants participate in this study, and only one participated in photo elicitation. In terms of recruitment, it was a closed recruitment strategy using purposive and snowball sampling. So we would directly target LGBTQI veteran communities, and we would rely on word of mouth, in essence. So our participants would mainly be recruited through Rainbow Veteran Canada's networks and membership. And the reason for closed recruitment was to circumvent issues regarding validating veteran status, which would require additional steps. And being a remote team, it would be a challenge to try and do in-person outreach and then conduct validation that way. So RVC would be, in effect, validating veteran status for us. And while that's helped recruitment significantly, it's also created challenges in getting participants to participate as well because of such a small target population. So about the participants in this study, all 10 participants were LGBT purge survivors from the Canadian Armed Forces. In terms of age, all were considered to be older adults aged 60 years and over, and having joined the military between ages 17 to 22 years of age. Some of them fresh out of high school, some of them while they were in high school, very young. For a race breakdown, 8 people that were interviewed were white and 2 identified as Métis. For gender, we had 1 trans woman, 3 non-binary people, 2 cis women, and 3 cis men. And for sexual orientation, we had 6 queer people, 2 gay people, and 1 lesbian. And the geographical distribution was spread throughout 5 Canadian provinces, which included British Columbia, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. And out of these, 9 experienced houselessness and housing insecurity, with only 1 having experienced only housing insecurity. Interestingly, all participants report never having stayed at a homeless shelter. 2 participants cite safety concerns for reasons why they don't want to stay in a shelter, related to their sexual and gender identity. Others provide no reason. They prefer to couch surf, stay with people who are part of the LGBT community, live with strangers, family, friends, or live in their vehicle. And in terms of data analysis, which is the current phase we're in right now, as we're wrapping up data collection, we're going to be using reflexive thematic analysis. And as we are in the beginning stages of data analysis, we only have some observations to share in this presentation, which can be divided into 2 main sections. The first being risk factors influencing houselessness and housing insecurity, and second, supportive factors to overcome houselessness and housing insecurity. So the initial research observations, the risk factors. The known risk factors to becoming unhoused and housing insecure are poverty, discrimination, military sexual trauma, difficulties with military career transition into civilian life. So in general, these are the known risk factors for veterans to becoming unhoused or living in poverty. Women and 2SLGBTQI veterans disproportionately face higher risks of becoming unhoused. And initial observation of research data supports the above risk factors that is established within the literature. So risk factors unique to 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans. So we identified potential risk factors here to houselessness and housing insecurity that are distinct from other marginalized groups and that are unique to the experiences of 2SLGBTQI Canadian veterans. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, one unique risk factor among this group is being an LGBT purge survivor. Now, not all 2SLGBTQI veterans are purge survivors, but for the purposes of this study, all of the participants were purge survivors. So the risk factors are the following. They could be grouped in these categories. The first being experiences of gender and sexual orientation-based discrimination. Second, experiences of military sexual trauma. Third would be military career transition into civilian life, particularly if these experiences are negative. And then discharge status and reason for release can be another risk factor, depending on what the release reason is, because this can also affect one's ability to access veteran services and benefits later on. And lastly, another grouped risk factor here is social isolation and lack of social connection, which can lead to the inability to trust others and avoidance of help-seeking behaviors. So the next slides will go into detail about each risk factor. We'll start with this quote. Here's an excerpt from Esther, a queer woman in her 60s from Ontario. She describes how discrimination is normalized in military culture and that she herself, as a queer woman, was complicit in the system. She says, the military wasn't just homophobic, it was also race, color. Like, this is a horrible story to tell, I'm embarrassed, but I was a part of it, and it was part of the culture that they had. Various systems of oppression, such as misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and racism, are deeply rooted in military culture. Discrimination and prejudice manifest as practices, procedures, and language, and becomes normalized. At times, discrimination is encouraged. And for LGBTQ veterans during the purge, taking part within a culture of discrimination, whether as an active participant or being silent and complicit, being part of this culture was sometimes a necessary evil to ensure one's survival. All participants recount having directly received discrimination in some form, attacking their sexual orientation and gender identity, leaving a lasting impact on their self-esteem, sense of belonging, mental health, and even their career mobility. For instance, Some participants recall that fighting against discrimination would lead to punishment and repercussions that would negatively impact prospects of promotion as well as their social standing. And at this time, if you were LGBT, you do not want to draw attention to yourself. You want to minimize yourself as much as possible. So fighting against perceived injustices, or just not perceived, but injustices in general, would draw negative attention to themselves, which they try to avoid at all costs. So here's another excerpt on discrimination in the military culture, with Micah describing the challenges of speaking out against discrimination. Several participants described the inner struggle of wanting to speak out against injustice, but feeling powerless to do so due to fear of repercussions. Micah says, and the jokes that are going on, all the fag jokes. Like, you can be in an environment, you're uncomfortable, you feel it's wrong, and sometimes you should speak up, but it's not really in your interest to do that at this moment. You might want to just shut your mouth until you get out of the dodge, right? So meaning you want to shut your mouth until you're out of the situation that you're in. So the next risk factor is military sexual trauma. It's not a unique experience to 2SLGBTQI veterans. However, how MST is experienced by 2SLGBTQI veterans differs from non-2SLGBTQI veterans. So, military sexual trauma, MST, refers to sexual assault or harassment experienced during military service. All participants have reported to have experienced some form of MST during their military service. The nature of MST differs across genders, though there is an undercurrent of having to prove one's heterosexuality and conformity to gender roles and expectations. Participants endured sexual harassment and assault while in the military to prevent being outed or being exposed as LGBT. For men, MST appears to be linked to how well they perform masculinity and conform to gender roles. Men who do not conform are at risk of being accused of being gay. And for men, MST was likely to occur during hazing rituals that were meant to validate masculinity and heterosexuality. For example, being sexually promiscuous and having sexual relations with many women. For participants who had served in the Navy, for instance, socializing with other male service members included engaging in sexual interactions with women while on shore. The only time that they're able to actually get out of the ship, right? That's their bonding and social ritual. For women, MST was likely to manifest as coercion and sexual harassment. Several female participants had recounted how women had to demonstrate sexual interest and availability towards men. Some felt they could not rebuff romantic or sexual advances from men due to fears of being accused and labeled as a lesbian. In this way, lesbian identity was weaponized against women by men. So here's an example of sexual harassment experienced by one participant. Karen describes their experience being interrogated by the Special Investigations Unit and the types of inappropriate questions asked of them. They say, there are many examples with the Special Investigations Unit, like asking a 17-year-old if she's ever performed cunnilingus before, and asking for graphic sexual details of lesbian lovemaking. I could go on, my dear. And here's an example from Nina, who describes the coercion and weaponization of lesbian identity that happened during this time as well. If a guy wanted you sexually and you rebuffed him really, it would be one way for sure to be labeled as a lesbian. Or if you know, we weren't always in uniform. Sometimes there were occasions where you're supposed to wear business, formal, or casual. And you know, if you weren't doing it feminine, implying that if you weren't dressing feminine enough, you would be labeled as a lesbian too. So there was these kinds of aspects that would draw negative attention towards them. All participants were honorably discharged. Despite being purged from the military, dishonorable discharge applies to extreme circumstances and has a more complicated process, including the military court. So it's actually quite uncommon. Reason for release is more consequential, as it provides some details as to the nature of the service member's departure from the military. Reasons for release among participants were voluntary departure, medical, or 5D, referring to the item not advantageously employable. In present-day CAF classification, 5D could fall under Item 2, unsatisfactory service, and under 5D, participants are not deemed fit to serve in the military and would not be considered to be employable in the future. In the interviews, despite the LGBT purge, participants had expressed pride in serving the military and would choose to serve again if were given the chance. But for those who received a 5D, they grieved over the fact that they are unable to pursue their lifelong dream and career serving in the military. For some people, this was their life's purpose. For most of them, actually, they were in the cadets or like their family members were in the military. This is what they had carved out for them since graduating high school. And then this was just taken away from them after being purged. So participants pointed out the psychological, social, and financial impact of the 5D classification, specifically the humiliation and shame of being forcibly removed from the military due to being LGBT or being suspected of being LGBT. Excuse me, I need to drink some water. Here, Micah describes the lasting repercussions of discharge status. Not only does it impact one's career prospects for access to benefits, but it also affects one's social standing and psychological state, such as feelings of shame or guilt, or of having been forced out of the military and being labeled as a national security risk, which was the rationale behind purging LGBT people during this time. So Micah says, there's a dishonorable discharge. You lose all your pension. You lose everything. It's crazy. They try to get you. They try to get you to get a job, but they outed you to the world, and now the world knows, right? They all know, and that's why you're kicked out. But it's not just being kicked out. You're not some administrative burden or something. You're booted. They classify you as a national security risk. And here's an account from Walter, who describes the psychological impact of being purged and losing their identity and sense of belonging. He says, as a military member, uniformity is also a way in which you are defined, as everyone knows you or interacts with you, calls you by your rank and last name. It is something you become accustomed to and almost take for granted. When you leave the military, you are simply known by your name, often your first name. In exiting the military, I became myself as a gay man, but also as an individual. Individuality, for all its great advantages, can also seem less connected to something meaningful. Whatever you are, as a tradesperson or as a service member, is all at once lost, and you appear differently to yourself and to others. So he's describing the loss of identity that happens of being purged. So transition from military to civilian life is another risk factor, and I would argue it's the most significant one. It's been established in the literature, but it seems it's also a recurring topic in the interviews. So events from the military transition to civilian life is a known risk factor for veteran homelessness. Veterans report not receiving enough support from the militaries. So during the purge, which was during the 70s, 80s, 90s, where participants were serving and had left the military, they received no supports. In several participant accounts, those who were purged were simply told to leave and were sometimes subject to verbal abuse. Many were told they would never be considered a veteran as they did not have enough years served to be granted veteran status card through VAC. Most participants had never served the minimum of 3 years, leaving them without government issue form of veteran status. Again, the psychological and emotional toll of being abruptly purged from the military contributes to this sense of shame. And with this culture of stoicism and self-reliance in the military, many felt that they could not ask for help, or they felt shame or guilt for even asking for any help or support. So they often isolated and kept to themselves. Here I'm sharing a reflection from Micah, where she describes how her life would be different had she received the proper support during her transition period. She says, I've been suffering and homeless and all that crap when I didn't have to for all those years. My life would have been completely different. Completely different. Wouldn't have been a struggle. I wouldn't have gone through everything. I would have had a pension to fall back on. It would have been okay. I would have had psychological support, and I didn't know how to deal psychologically with civilian life after dealing with all that crap. So she did not receive any information on how to secure housing, anything like that when she had left the military. She just felt like she went from one structure to another and had basically left to fend for herself. So her experience leads us to the next risk factor, which is access to benefits and services. So as I previously noted, length of time served and reason for release can determine one's access to certain VAC, Veteran Affairs Canada's benefits. For veteran status cards, it is typically required to have basic training and honorable release, and they're granted around 3 years. And they are used to legitimize veteran status and opens up access to getting services from VAC, such as mental health care. And then veteran pensions, which most participants didn't receive because they didn't serve 10 years. They're granted after a minimum of 10 years service. So purge survivors often had short military careers, serving no more than 2 years, at least the ones that I interviewed for this study. Among these participants, 6 out of 10 had a military career that was less than 2 years, and only 4 had served over 2 years, with 2 participants having received some form of pension, and one of them was a medical pension. And purge survivors were able to access VAC services after the class action lawsuit. The government recognized purge survivors as veterans even if they did not meet the minimum 3 years of service. Purge survivors are encouraged to approach VAC, but VAC does not individually reach out to purge survivors. At least prior to the class action lawsuit, but they still don't individually reach out to them and like cold call. Therefore, the onus is up to the individual veteran to reach out to VAC. Navigating the system can be difficult for some for reasons due to trauma, distrust in the government, among other reasons. So here, Richard describes his departure from the military and how, because of his time served, he was told he wasn't a veteran, barring him from accessing any veteran services in the future. He says, at the time, the policy was that you didn't qualify as a veteran. You had no right to veteran services, so it was a complete break. There were no services available. We were specifically told then that you're not a veteran, you will never be a veteran, and you'll never have access to veteran services, so don't even try. So there's another disconnect here as well. So many were told that they are not a veteran. So if they were told that, they don't want to go seek help, even if they should, right? So that's like a problem here as well. And so the next risk factor is social isolation and lack of support systems. Purge survivors have many unique stressors, such as being in the closet and having to constantly be on guard and being unable to trust. There is the shame, again, of being purged. Some did not disclose to their friends and family about the circumstances of why they left the military. Some of them never said that, like, they would lie and say that they chose to leave, but it would be like a contradiction to like their character identity because they dreamed of being in the military. So they'd have to lie to their families sometimes, or some of them could not bear the shame of saying, I got kicked out of the military because I'm gay. So they kept a lot of this to themselves. As well, when people talk about the military, a sense of camaraderie among service members is mentioned. But for purge survivors, it's not always the case, at least not the way non-LGBT veterans would talk about it. During the purge, it was encouraged for service members to report anyone they suspect as LGBT. And so they lived under constant suspicion. I'm sorry about that. Lived under constant suspicion, and they were encouraged to report one another. So it made it difficult to form friendships with others. And being able to form communities among other LGBTQ members in the military was not possible during this time because you get caught, you'd be interrogated, you get purged. So they couldn't even offer, like community support with one another. It just didn't exist at the time. So Esther, a queer woman in her 60s from Ontario, shares how she felt isolated and ashamed due to her being purged. She says, "What do I still carry today? Shame, loneliness, lack of trust, lack of relationship. Because who do I trust to be in one? So I just locked myself up, emotionally, physically, and spiritually." And she shares the consequences resulting from the purge. She says, "I had absolutely no help, no support, nothing. And I wasn't going to go home because I already felt enough shame. I couldn't face my mom saying, 'Oh, by the way, I got kicked out of the military and I don't know why, and now I'm homeless,' right? I couldn't do it." Romantic relationships and partnerships can provide emotional and financial support and can positively impact one's housing status. Dual income households are becoming increasingly necessary to survive and to attain secure housing. Participants share the negative impact of the purge on being able to form relationships. 2 participants report not being able to be in a romantic relationship ever again due to the experiences of the purge and have remained single and unmarried for the rest of their lives. Curtis shares how the purge has impacted his relationships. He says, "It's called internalized homophobia. It's a pathological disorder. It robs you of both energy and mental power and stamina, self-esteem, and the ability to build associations in relationships and so forth. You haven't asked me, but I'll tell you. I've never had a relationship since 1982. I don't know how to do them. And when I asked him why, he just said the culture of having to betray others, being constantly on guard, it was just not tenable to forming relationships. So ever since then, he just doesn't want to engage in them at all. And that's the case for other participants as well, in being unable to form romantic partnerships, unfortunately. So that ends the risk factors section of this presentation. We're going to be going towards the supportive factors to overcoming houselessness and housing insecurity. These are the initial findings for supportive factors to overcoming houselessness. These are mutual aid and support from the LGBT community, impact of romantic and domestic partnerships on finances, which we already briefly touched upon in the previous section, financial windfalls such as receiving inheritance or payouts from VAC or the purge class action lawsuit, and getting support from family members. So 9 out of 10 participants in the study received some form of support and mutual aid from a member from the 2SLGBTQ community. Participants received aid in the form of having a safe place to stay with no cost or low cost rent, such as couch surfing, until they achieve financial stability, assistance navigating social services and accessing benefits, networking, such as leads on 2SLGBTQI friendly housing and employment opportunities. So here we have Stan, who's a gay man in his 60s from Ontario, who shares his experience being supported by other LGBTQ members in his community. He says, I was taken under the wing by a number of women in the armed forces, lesbians at the time, that I didn't know were lesbians because I was just too naive about everything. But they knew my plight and they helped. They didn't let me starve to death in the early days that I left the military. And 5 out of 10 participants identified moving in with a partner as a critical factor to achieving housing stability. And being able to transition from a single income to a dual income household helped to achieve financial stability and alleviate financial stress. And besides financial benefits, there was the positive impact on one's mental health, self-esteem, and confidence, and being able to confide with one another about their problems instead of being socially isolated, which left them better equipped to handle stressors and difficult times. The next supportive factor was financial windfalls. 3 out of 10 participants report having a financial windfall or receiving a large sum of money or inheriting property as a significant factor in overcoming houselessness. The circumstances that led to financial windfalls included receiving a lump sum payment from VAC, either as like a medical benefits from PTSD, for example, a medical pension, or a lump sum from the LGBT purge class action lawsuit, inheritance from a deceased parent. At least 2 participants in the study, they were able to get the lump sum or the financial windfall from these situations to purchase a house. So that's one way they were able to overcome and achieve financial stability and housing stability in that way. And then 3 out of 10 participants attributed receiving support from family members as a supportive factor to overcoming houselessness. So family members were supportive of participants' gender identity and sexual orientation, were able to navigate difficulties much better than those who weren't. Participants with supportive family members are currently living with family or have lived with family on a long-term basis before moving out on their own, and that helped them to achieve financial stability and housing stability. And the other supportive factors to overcoming houselessness that I found in the interviews were securing long-term employment, such as working a stable job, access to social services and programming, attending post-secondary education. A few participants had noted that being able to secure a student loan was one way for them to at least have the money they need right now to secure housing instead of living on the streets or in their car. And also finding alternative low-cost housing solutions to get out of living on the streets. So like having a tiny home, which still requires some income, but that was one way instead of paying rent somewhere else or having a huge mortgage. Living in a campground, that was another way. Or with some of the participants that received the lump sum, they were able to use that to fix dilapidated like old homes and make into some to their own home, their dwellings. So those were some ways they were able to overcome their housing insecurity. And to finish this presentation, I will leave you with Stan's statement on receiving empathy in service provision. He says, "The caseworker that visited me, I told her my story. I don't have any money to pay rent and I don't have any money to buy groceries." And she was very positive. She expressed her sympathy that I was kicked out of the armed forces for being queer and how wrong that was, and that she had this idea of this rooming house and how it would be much more affordable than where I was staying. Then I got a check, and it was enough to pay for a couple of weeks' rent and some groceries. For Stan, having a caseworker who understood his struggles was an integral aspect to him achieving eventually financial stability. I've shared observations on risk factors and supportive factors, but not much in terms of paths forward. Currently, there are no services specifically tailored to 2S LGBTQI veterans, let alone those that focus specifically on housing. A path forward is to improve service provision, educating service workers, and building empathy into service provision, and feeling seen are some ways to achieve that, as Stan had said. He told me in the interviews that one way to alleviate or improve housing and poverty for 2S LGBTQI veterans is just empathy and having people there, service providers, to have that tailored approach, understanding where they come from and not being judgmental. And since this project is still ongoing with data analysis, that is what I have for today. The path forward in terms of timelines for this project is finishing data analysis. Hopefully, maybe we can get a few other people to participate in the study, but we are moving forward with data analysis, and we'll have a report published in spring 2026. Thank you for attending this webinar.
Thanks so much, Kazel.
I stop sharing the screen.
Sure.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, if folks have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A.
The window now.
Yeah.
Now it doesn't
Now
distract my.
I mean, to maybe start us off, like I had a question, if that's okay, to get the ball rolling here. But I was curious if there were like any more differences in kind of participants' experiences around gender that you noticed coming up, like whether that's supports or maybe like risks. Like did those experiences look different? Especially thinking about like the trans and gender diverse folks that you had in your sample, like you had like a decent amount of folks there. So like did those experiences maybe look different compared to
Well,
other participants?
well, in terms of risk factors, I would say I outlined them in the military sexual trauma aspect of
Hmm.
this presentation. It was it was very stark, the differences of like how they were harassed in essence, like for like women identified people. They they would be, I guess, being extortion coerced into
Mm,
dating others in the forces in ways that men
yeah.
did not have that pressure.
Mm.
um right, like women, like if women didn't want to date like a man, he would call her a lesbian. And I also did note that in the interviews I spoke with several women and gender diverse people, like cis women at least. Like there was a huge softball culture in the military,
Incredible.
and that was apparently like a unspoken safe haven, I think,
Huh,
for lesbian. Like
cool.
there was a stereotype that if you played softball you're a lesbian, and there has been like a cisgender heterosexual person that I know of that they were purged because they played softball and they weren't feminine
Mm,
enough, even though they're not
right.
gay or like lesbian.
Hmm.
And I asked more about that from other people who were also involved in softball in the interviews, and they said that like the softball was kind of like this gateway though to meeting other lesbians, at least like in
Hmm.
their base in the community, because they would have after parties after the softball games, and then they would have after parties after the after parties, and that's where lesbians and other queer people would be invited. So they had like these community groups type of things. Again, that
That's
was
cool.
unspoken, largely unknown to like the outsiders. That was not seen at least not mentioned with men in the
Mm.
interviews.
Whoa, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Just like the ways that it's like queer people still find a way to come together, even in an environment that doesn't facilitate that at all. That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
And then for men too, they like a lot of, I guess, the harassment came from not conforming to
Mm,
masculinity, or what perceived masculinity. They constantly had to perform, and it was usually through like like perceptions of like sexual conquest and all
mm,
that. How much whoever sleeps with the most women, they're so manly, right? And then
Mm.
they'll be questioned like, well, why don't I see you with girls? Like especially those who lived in the
mm,
Navy, they'll be like, like they get monitored. I had to remove a slide in the presentation because of time, but an there was like an excerpt from an interview where this one participant, he felt constantly surveilled at all times, like when
mm,
he was in the Navy on shore by other people, not only policing the way, like, like how he sat, how he talked, even how he socialized
mm,
with other men. They couldn't form close friendships. That's another thing too, is that men, like because of like perceptions of being gay, they had to closely monitor themselves in forming close
mm,
friendships with others, and they just couldn't. Hold on, my bat. I don't know why it's not plugging in. And so my battery, sorry. So that's just one way that happened.
yeah,
They kept their distance. Meanwhile, it was not necessarily the case for that with women. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, that's interesting. And then I guess like you kind of just mentioned this a little bit, but sort of like thinking about like you just mentioned like folks who are in the Navy, like maybe that looked a different way. Did you find that kind of like there were differences in experiences based on kind of like what branch of the military that like your participants had been in?
Um, I didn't see, at least with the sample size that I had, I didn't see like much difference with the Navy. With the different branches. The
Mm,
majority of the participants were actually in the Air Force, but those
mm,
that did mention the Navy, there was that new. Most of them were men, because I think
mhm,
like at a certain point back then during the purge, like women weren't allowed to serve in the Navy.
mm,
So and they had mentioned that like the Navy made it really difficult at least to be closeted, like at least because they're
mhm.
living in such close quarters on a ship, and so
Right.
they really had to watch themselves on that. There was another story I forgot to share. Actually, this was like also regarding the Navy. There's this one participant who, this is regarding also like feeling safe and social isolation on the topic of that.
Mhm,
You have mental health professionals, medics working in the Navy, and you couldn't even confide to them because they would
mm,
Mm.
tell on you.
right.
Basically. Being in such close quarters with people in the Navy, you can form relationships, but then people might take it the wrong way, and
Mm,
or sometimes you just form close relationships with others. And um, he had disclosed that he had gotten feelings for one of his Navy mates back then, and because he was asking like what's bothering you emotionally, and I think when you're so young too, that's another aspect. They're all like in their teenagers or in their early
right.
20s. You don't know how to handle emotions. Yeah, you disclose to somebody that you feel is safe, and then they turn out not to be safe. I think I went off tangent there, but that's just thinking about like the Navy
Yeah.
there. I didn't, at least right now at this stage of like looking at the data, I didn't see any themes or emerging topics with the specific branches like the Air
Mm,
Force, but that might change as I get
yeah,
deeper into coding. Yeah.
totally.
Well, I think it's a good time to wrap up. So I just want to thank you, Gazel, for the incredible preliminary research findings and sharing all of that with us. If there's no further questions, we can bring this session to a close. If folks do think of additional questions, you can always email us at research@egal.ca. That's research@egal.ca. If you'd like to stay informed of EGAL's work, you can always follow us on social media at EGAL Canada.
Thank you.
I'd like to
Mhm.
thank Gazel and Bree for the light moderation and for all the research and thoughtful presentations that we had throughout the series. And as we continue to amplify underrepresented perspectives and challenge dominant discourses through our work. We at EGAL hope that you have all gained new insights and inspirations for making your work, your communities more welcoming and inclusive of 2S LGBTQI identifying people. So on behalf of EGAL, I would like to thank you all for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.